So we'll have three different presenters. Chris Otterness from Houston Engineering will go first, giving some background on some utility examples that they've dealt with. Again, kind of that pipeline example and how they've approached it there. I will also talk about a pipeline example from my work at Coon Creek that there's the distinct possibility is the same sort of pipeline set that's being discussed in Rice Creek. And Chuck will go into some details on some more large scale sort of utility overlaps and how that was managed, and some of the unique things that they came up with there. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chris. There'll be a little bit of jockeying back and forth between our presentations here. We'll try to limit ourselves to around 10 to 12 minutes or so on our presentations so that there's time for questions as we wrap up. But Chris, I will turn it over to you to talk about the Rice Creek utility instances that you've run into.
Great, thanks, Tom. Is my presentation showing up correctly on here?
It is. It's showing your next slide, but that's okay.
Oh, okay. Well, let me see if I can.
We see the main slide too, Chris. I think you can go through that route. It works. I think you
Thanks. Well, again, appreciate the opportunity to talk here at the conference. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the pipeline specifically in Rice Creek Watershed District, a bit of a deep dive into how we've been a earlier presentation, and really talking about a framework that we've developed that helps us move along in addressing these concerns. And again, this is the same photo here that Ashley had shown before of an Oak County Ditch 31. I believe this is a Magellan petroleum pipeline in this instance, but dangling above the open channel of the ditch. So a little background on this, as Ashley kind of alluded to before, Watershed District Rice Creek has undergone this systematic effort over the last 13 years or so of repairing its public drainage systems. They've been in disrepair in general throughout. And one of the things we found as we started working on each one of these systems is that we ran into conflicts with these pipelines along the system. So Rice Creek is traversed by 4 major pipelines. I think most of them are petroleum pipelines, although one of them is a high pressure gas line, Northern Natural Gas. There has been little to no engagement at the Rice Creek Watershed District over the years as these pipelines have been constructed. You know, in the past, prior to 1973, the counties were the managers of the drainage systems, and some of these pipelines were constructed even before 1973. But we don't have any record of the county having any discussions with these pipeline companies. But even in more recent years, just a few years ago, there was one crossing. That was one of them that Ashley showed earlier on JD3 that was reconstructed or installed with no permitting done with the Rice Creek Watershed District. The pipeline company wasn't aware of that. So that again gets to what Ashley talked about, of trying to make people a little more aware of the process that needs to be followed. And certainly this framework that I'm going to be discussing goes to that a little bit, and trying to make the pipeline companies a little more aware of their requirements in doing any work on these systems. And as such, because they had not had discussions with the watershed district, there was little or no focus on the depth of the pipeline relative to the as constructed condition of the drainage system. And as you see in some of these slides here, some of these pipelines either don't meet or barely even meet the cover standards outside of the public drainage system, let alone where they're crossing into the drainage system. One of these examples, this same photo here again, you can see the Magellan pipeline here. It barely even has a couple feet of cover on it when you get over outside of the area of the public drainage system, but they didn't have any awareness at the time that the public drainage system was even there, because the ditch had filled in with sediment over the years. It had seen little or no maintenance on this system in its 120 years of existence. And so again, with that in mind, that pipeline was constructed. The Rice Creek Watershed District completed repairs on either side of the pipeline, left the middle. We had a pipeline representative on site that directed the work being done and keeping at least 20 feet away from either side of the system. However, when the ditch was re-excavated on either side of the pipeline, the sediment that was on either side of the pipeline washed out, and now you have this dangling pipeline that's here. This condition has been in existence now for a few years. The pipeline company is well aware of its condition, but has not lowered it yet. So that was kind of, a very obvious condition there, having a pipeline dangling here. Another example of how they conflict is having the pipeline at or near the bottom of the historic ditch bottom. Here's another example of Judicial Ditch 3. And the pipeline, it did become partially exposed again after repair work that was completed along the drainage system. What cover there was over the pipeline, which was very minimal, ended up getting cleaned away by the natural flow water through there. There certainly is the potential on something like this for further undercutting underneath the pipeline, which will worsen its condition. And certainly in this condition, it is blocking the drainage system. It is decreasing the benefit of the capacity of the drainage system by having the pipeline running through it. Another way that the pipelines may provide a conflict with the drainage system is even when they are below the original channel bottom, they may prevent the ditch from being cleaned. And I have a little graphic here that kind of shows this. The red line on the graphic shows the cover of or I should say the ditch bottom when it would be excavated to its original channel bottom. The blue line on here would be what the ditch could be excavated to, with consideration that a minimum amount of cover would be required over the pipeline for pipeline safety requirements. Usually that's right around 2 to 3 feet. In such a case, again, if that pipeline is even just below that original channel bottom, it is resulting in an obstruction because that top can't be cleaned out. We've seen this a number of times in the Rice Creek Watershed District, this hump that may result. It may or may not wash out with heavy rainfall, but one of the other unforeseen things that may occur with this is that having a small hump in the drainage system does create an additional problem with beavers. They see that and they like to build on top of that existing bump repeatedly. And we've seen that in a few spots in the watershed district. So how we go about trying to resolve these conflicts? Well, we tried first of all on a case-by-case basis. We see a conflict on the landscape there. We talked to the pipeline company about it. And then in some cases make a request for lowering. That has resulted in a little amount of headway with these pipeline companies. We have one case where the pipeline company did lower the pipeline at that after that request. However, what happens is the pipeline companies are unaware of the scope of the problem. It's a very large problem for the watershed district, and it could be a very significant problem in terms of pipeline safety for them. So if they don't know all of the locations on their pipeline that are in conflict, they may not address it right away or address it appropriately. And there are challenges in lowering these pipelines. It's not easy to do it. It can be very costly, particularly if you have one of these petroleum pipelines where they run pigs in the pipeline to clean out the pipeline. Those pigs cannot traverse significant changes or bends in the pipeline. And so they may actually have to lower the pipeline up to a half mile in either direction to allow for a 2 to 3 foot lowering of the pipeline. So the watershed district determined that there's a different approach is needed for this kind of issue. Doing a holistic look at the pipeline crossings rather than one by one, and trying to enforce some sort of urgency in the pipeline companies. And so how we started with this was a framework we worked with the watershed district to develop to address these issues. And the first part of this framework is in doing an inventory of all the pipeline crossings. This graphic here shows the pipeline crossings within the Rice Creek watershed district. And we found out through GIS mapping that there were actually 61 intersections of the public drainage systems with these 4 pipelines. In doing so, we identified 19 known conflicts of the pipeline with the drainage system, where we actually had surveyed elevation showing a conflict with that as constructed condition. But we also identified there were several more locations that had unknown elevations of those pipelines. And so then what we did is complete a field survey of these locations to try to resolve whether or not these actually were in conflict. And this starts off with a go for one call and coordination directly with the pipeline representative in the field. And in order to do this from a global perspective, we tried to complete a review of all the crossings on a single pipeline in one day with that representative, identifying the known exposed locations, the known conflict locations, and then letting them know that there's going to be additional correspondence from the Rice Creek watershed district in a very short time period, kind of trying to ratchet up that urgency with these representatives. So then we follow up with a contact letter to the utility, and we inform them that there are these obstructions on the drainage system. We map them out, identify the elevations that are involved with the drainage system bottom and the pipeline itself. It provided some of these photos where those pipelines are exposed. And then we notify them of the statutory obligations, and there's a couple of them involved. One of them is 103E075 regarding obstruction of the drainage system. And you know, again, be reminded that these public drainage systems were here first before the pipelines, so the pipelines had an obligation not to block them off. And then there's also a Pipeline Safety Act that is engaged as well. And one of the ways that we also try to show this importance or concern about this is providing a copy of this letter to a couple different folks. One of them is the DNR Land and Minerals Licensing Division, who license the crossing of the public waters, many of which these public waters are also public drainage systems. And then the Office of Pipeline Safety, the state office, and letting them know that we have a concern about this as well. And then we also finish off the letter with a description of the next steps and timelines, which include follow-up correspondence if we don't get a reaction from the pipeline. And that has already occurred. So we've already sent off 2 of these letters. We found out that 2 of the 4 pipelines did not have conflicts with the public drainage system, but of the 2 that did, we already sent off that first initial correspondence. One of the pipeline companies, we got no response within a 2-month period, so we issued a second letter, reminding them of the same things we did of the first one, and that a hearing will be imminent if no response is received from those companies. And that actually did prompt a response from that pipeline company to engage the watershed district. So that's kind of where we're at right now with the Rice Creek Watershed District response with those pipeline companies. We still have not had a full response from them as to how they're going to resolve the conditions, but we've at least gotten some indication that they're interested in looking into it. If we do determine that no action is being taken in a prompt amount of time, then we can notice an obstruction hearing per statute 103E075, which includes a hearing where the pipeline company will have the opportunity to weigh in on their view on the obstruction. And then following a hearing, the watershed district can order the obstruction be removed and set a date specific for the removal of that obstruction. So that was a quick overview of this Rice Creek Watershed District framework, and I can either answer a few questions now or later once the other panelists are done.
Thanks, Chris. Any quick questions for Chris? Otherwise, we'll run through the other two panelists, myself and Chuck as well. And then there will be hopefully about 15 minutes for questions near the end, if anyone has any. Seeing none or hearing none at this point, what we'll do then is we'll move into, I'm going to share my screen. I'm having a little bit of issues with PowerPoint this morning, so I've printed my slideshow to a PDF. So I'm going to give that a shot, and hopefully that works to be able to share my screen. All right. Give me one moment here. So Chris has talked about the work that they've done on sort of a comprehensive overview of reviewing the various aspects of their drainage projects, and how that plays into the work with their drainage system and the utility crossings. What I'm going to just share with folks, and if I could get someone to unmute, just let me know if they can see my screen, is a very specific instance that we ran into. Yep. Can you see it? I'm sorry.
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Of a very specific instance that we had at Coon Creek Watershed District. So again, I'm Tom Gile, the Resource Conservation Section Manager with the Board of Water and Soil Resources. I met with folks from Coon Creek Watershed District and got some information from them to share a story about when I used to work at the Watershed District before, as many folks have told me, that I turned to the dark side and started working for the state. So a little background really quickly on Coon Creek Watershed District, just for location purposes and some of what we deal with there. We're located in Anoka County, kind of the south central portion of Anoka County. Rice Creek Watershed District is the neighboring watershed to the east. As some of the same situations that Rice Creek deals with, we're an area that has dealt with extensive urban expansion over the last 15 to 20 years. Approximately the upper half, and now more closely the upper third of the watershed to the north and east portion is fairly heavy ag with some rural residential development happening within it. And the southern half to 2/3 of the district is predominantly fairly intense urban developed landscape. So we have a unique balance that we try to strike between making sure that we have sufficient agricultural drainage in the headwaters regions and where there's agricultural land use, to managing from a flooding and stormwater management perspective throughout the district, but certainly more prevalent in the southern third. Geographically speaking, the Coon Creek Watershed District lies within the Anoka Sand Plain. So while we do have some gently rolling topography within the watershed district, there are many portions of the drainage systems in our upper reaches that run on 0.1% slope. So a very similar sort of drainage topography from what a person may well find in the Red River Valley, where it's exceedingly flat. Instances where if you get a tree that falls down in the drainage system and is obstructing flow, that water can be backed up for in some instances miles. So very sensitive landscape, and a bulk of our drainage ends up being, even though we have open drainage systems, is through subsurface drainage because of the sandy, coarse sort of aggregate soils that we predominantly have intermixed with areas of high organic and sort of peat bog areas or peat bed type areas. So we've heard from Ashley and some others that talked about their rules and some of the methods that they use for managing crossings. So there are two aspects of Coon Creek's Watershed District's rules that are applicable when it comes to our sort of utility crossing issues. In this particular instance that we're going to talk about, one area that came into playing is the part of our rules, section 8.1 in Coon Creek Watershed District's rules. No bridge or culvert for the disposition of stormwater shall be constructed, reconstructed, or laid without approval of the board as to its location, size and elevation, and a permit for the installation thereof from the board. So essentially any permit or any road crossing, any bridge, any culvert that is installed on the public drainage system requires a permit within the district. The permit specifically calls out the size of the culvert that is required to manage flows within the district, and also requires the elevations be set within a certain tolerance to ensure that we're not creating any crossings that are too high or too low. In a landscape like that, and again, similar to what folks may see in the Red River Valley, many of those culverts actually end up being the control for the drainage elevations within the system.
Hey, Tom, we're not seeing
Yes.
your slides advance. We're just seeing your first slide.
Interesting. All right. Let me see if I can share this differently then. Can you see that now or not?
It's on the where you see the whole PowerPoint and then all the individual slides on the left-hand side. I think that's why we're not seeing it advance. We're not seeing the presentation part.
Okay, let me see if I can change my sharing options as I keep working through things here. So when we deal with these sorts of crossings, the other instance that comes into play is our utility crossings. Similar to what is done within Rice Creek Watershed District, we require utility crossings be placed at or below the public drainage system elevation by 4 feet. Is it sharing correctly now?
Now it looks like the PDF. But
Okay,
yes, we
perfect.
can see it as
I'll
long as
run-
you
I'll
advance
run
while you're
through the-
talking.
I'll run through the PDF if that works a little bit better. So the next section of our rules that is applicable is that utility crossing section. Again, as I noted, very similar to the methodology that Rice Creek Watershed District has, where we require at least 4 feet of separation between the top of the utility crossing or the utility pipe or whatever that utility is and the approved ditch elevation. So with that, a little bit of background on this specific site. Again, just to the east off of this map is our boundary with the Rice Creek Watershed District. You can see in the middle here where we have a nesting of coke pipeline crossings. There are actually 3 pipelines that cross over County Ditch 44-8 under a single field access. You can see where those pipelines run through this field. Coke has actually purchased easement from that landowner to use that area as a field access so that they don't cultivate over it, to ensure that they have adequate cover over those pipes. This part of the district is intensively drained. You can see on the map all of the blue lines, a number of private and public ditch sections here. Upstream from the crossing, this coke pipeline crossing is now much lower density agricultural land use than it has been historically, as some of that residential development has taken place. So really the only agricultural field that's served by this section anymore is the field immediately adjacent to the ditch. And on the other side of the public ditch to the east, approximately 1,600 feet away, is another lateral of the public system, County Ditch 44-7, along with several private ditches that interconnect and provide some drainage there as well. So as I mentioned, this crossing is a little bit unique in that this came to our attention because we had this apparent obstruction that had been identified some years before. I'll talk about that background. But the specific instance came up because we had a permit application from the Anoka County Highway Department. So when we look at that road crossing, or that road that runs north-south immediately adjacent to this County Ditch 44-8, it's currently, or was currently, a 2-lane road of Lexington Avenue. The County Highway Department, due to the urban expansion in their long-range plan, had submitted the permit application with the Watershed District to expand that to a 4-lane road. As noted before, that project required a permit from the Watershed District for a number of reasons. Work in and adjacent to what in our rules is called waters of the district, or waters, the open water bodies within the district. Drainage sensitive lands with the agricultural land use next to it. There were wetland impacts associated with it. Work within the floodplain being done. Certainly stormwater management under the MS4 program in managing the discharge for water quality components. and the ditch and driveway and road crossings and other utility crossings associated with this project. So again, as some folks are familiar, when you have a fairly significant road construction or linear project, there's a lot of utilities, there's a lot of interconnections with the different rules that we have. Again, 44.8 lies immediately adjacent, so essentially functions almost as the roadside ditch, though not exactly, at least when it was in its 2-lane format. And again, the watershed district rules require any relocated utilities to be 4 feet below the approved elevation, and any new or replaced culverts need to be set to the approved elevation, as was noted before. So here's an example or the picture of these pipelines as they cross through this road crossing. So again, what you see here is essentially a field road with the culvert underneath, and you can see these 3 nested pipelines, which one lies ever so slightly below the approved ditch elevation, which is this dashed line you can see in the bottom here, hopefully, which is probably very similar to what Chris had shown before, with an instance of the drainage system needing to provide some cover over top, one that is clearly above the elevation and one that's below it. The irony behind those pipelines being located like that is that in addition to them being set there, there's a culvert that's already set between those. Through the years, we had found out approximately 5 years before this that this culvert was a 36-inch culvert that was actually squished flat and fished through these oil pipelines that were set under this crossing. So other than the outlet ends of the pipe, the invert on the upper and lower ends, which were set very close to or within our tolerances for the approved elevations, almost none of this pipe functioned as it was supposed to. So as I mentioned, what we had done is we had reached out to Koch Pipeline approximately 5 years beforehand and had some conversations with them about the obstruction that was in this ditch system here. Koch had spoke with us and we met in their office. They had proposed to us that the estimated cost of them trying to address this and lower their pipelines, as Chris noted, due to the length of work that they would have to do and the shutdown of their oil pipeline, was going to be in the neighborhood of $7 to $10 million to require the pipelines to be moved. At that point, it became very apparent that from their perspective, spending money on the legal fees to fight it was going to be a sounder investment from their perspective than it was going to be to work with us to try and resolve the issue. So the county's project became somewhat hamstringed because as a part of widening the road, they needed to move the culvert. They needed to place the culvert at the location of the ditch crossing, and that was physically impossible to do. It was a really challenging instance of how do we manage the expectations and the rules of the district to be practical and reasonable in working with the county, because they had a project that it wasn't necessarily right to hold up that project as account of something that was out of their control. At the time, we had some conversations. I had reached out to Al Kane at Bowser and talked through what are some of the options that we could pursue. Given that there was still flow allowable, we could fit a 12-inch pipe between these oil pipelines, but there was no way we could get it at the approved ditch elevation. And what we ended up doing was we spoke with the county about pursuing an impoundment under 103E 227. It's a little bit of a different animal in that is predominantly talks about some sort of a public benefit or a benefit to the system that would come out of doing that impoundment, which is typically associated with some sort of water quality improvement project. And it was a little bit of I don't know that I'd say it was the best fit, but the county ended up submitting a petition to us to work through that process. So we ended up received the petition. Our engineers went through and looked at the modeling with the proposed 12-inch pipe that was installed to be installed. The county highway department had contacted us and spoke with us about what they would fund for costs associated with the reroute. I'm going to scroll back up here in an effort not to make folks too dizzy. What was proposed was to create a minor impoundment, so lifting above the approved elevation at the location of this pipe, and essentially having water run north to the north of the culvert and run south during low flows to the south end. This private lateral that connected between 44.8 and 44.7 was acquired through this process. The county actually acquired the right of way, and it became a new lateral to the public drainage system that connected these two ditches and ran the water during low flows and high flows around and back up to the public system. So the county submitted the petition. We went through the process and reviewed it. Interestingly enough, during our modeling, there's a number of instances during low flows where we have water that more backs out of the public system up into these than otherwise would drain out into the public drainage system to the north. We did have some issues during the proceedings for this. When it was called an impoundment proceeding, just the perception from some of the agricultural land users around there that we were creating new impoundment or newly intending to hold water back and restrict that drainage, when the reality was the impoundment that we were proposing was already in existence and trying to work through that process. So it was a little bit of a navigation within the rule and within the hearings. In the end, the county was able to put in that 12-inch pipe between the pipelines, offset that a little bit further so they could facilitate the expansion of the road process. When I met with Tim Kelly from the Coon Creek Watershed District recently, actually, he was just at a retirement party of someone from the county, maybe a month before I met with him. And the county actually just finally got the last signature on the easement because some of those lands were in trust and required in excess of 30 to 40 signatures to make sure the easements went through. So it was an ongoing continuous process in some of the permit approvals. And it just goes to show that, you know, when you have, it's one thing to have a sort of linear project where you have utilities already crossing your public drainage system. But then when something else triggers requirements under the rules, it can certainly create its own set of circumstances and complements. Now, certainly we can debate whether this was the correct procedure to go through, but it was a method that maintained and facilitated the sufficient drainage for the agricultural land use around it, did not have any impact or adverse impact on the flood elevations within the area through the modeling that was done, and was still able to facilitate the county getting their permit. And I think those are a couple of important components with a project like this that goes through. So with that said, that's a little bit of background on a very unique project that we had dealt with at the Coon Creek Watershed District in a similar fashion. And I will turn it over to Chuck to talk about some of the work that they've run into on some larger scale sort of grid crossing type projects that they've dealt with at the Heron Lake Watershed District. Give me one moment and I'll stop sharing my screen here. All right, Chuck, the floor is yours.
All right, can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
I can see the screen, yes, but it's showing your entire PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, let me just see if I can. Hang on. I can't. I'm getting there. All right, how about that?
Perfect.
All right, so I'm going to talk about Jackson JD19 in the Heron Lake Watershed District. Tim Stahl talked a little bit about this project and what happens after a project is in and we want to do an improvement, and some of the challenges that we ran into with that project. So again, I'm Chuck Brandel with ISG. I lead our water group here at ISG. It's a little bit of presentation overview. So you look at the picture. I've got many pictures within the watershed. You can see the large number of windmills within this watershed. The history on JD19 is it was established as a lot of drainage systems were over 100 years ago, back in 1919 or early 1910s. Then there was an improvement in 1919, so it had two main lines. The DNR purchased a property and had a WMA within the watershed. They abandoned parts of the system. And then in 2016, landowners decided that the system was in poor shape and under capacity and wanted to move forward with an improvement, getting the drainage coefficient to a 1/2-inch drainage coefficient. We worked with the DNR since they had the WMA and looked at a restoration It's called the TOW WMA. And we actually got a Conservation Partners Legacy Grant to restore part of the wetland within the watershed. And then we also worked with the city of Lakefield on a storage pond as part of the design. So just kind of giving you the location here. JD 19 is in purple. This is South Heron Lake. Has about a 43,000 acre watershed, and JD 19 is about 3,000 acres of that. Drains through the city of Lakefield into JD 3 and then into South Heron Lake. Here's JD 19, a lot of tile within this system, a lot of windmills within the system. So there's 75,000 feet of tile, and landowners requested to improve most of it, or pretty much all of it. So the green lines represent all of the tile that were being proposed to be improved. Here is the WMA that we were proposing to reroute tile around. And then if you look at all of the purple lines, those are windmill power lines and the connections to all the windmills. So the proposed improvement had 19 proposed crossings. Some of those crossings had multiple power lines. There were 30 windmills within the watershed. So there's obviously a lot of coordination that needed to be done to make this project work. So each one of these dots is a proposed crossing of the electrical lines. We had a lot of good information. The county had worked with the company that constructed the system. We knew where all of the power lines were. We knew where the existing system was, but the proposed improvement was deepening the system by 3 to 4 feet in some locations. We tried to coordinate all of the crossings of the windmill transmission lines near where the existing crossings were. So from a coordination standpoint, we reached out to a company that was called EDF. They had an office in the city of Lakefield. They took over the project after it was constructed. We contacted EDF in the summer of 2017, showed them the plan that was being developed for the final engineer's report, talked about installation procedures. We knew where all the crossings were. We told them that we would invite them to the pre-construction meeting, talked about our procedures for crossings, that we would open cut with no additional requirements. They would leave their system running, but that we would have to go through a little bit of their safety program, and that safety was a priority. So in the fall of 2017, the improvement was approved. We had a cost for crossing all of these electrical lines. And then in February of 2018, the project was bid. Sometime in between there, the initial contact we had with EDF left the company, and I don't think they shared all of the information that we discussed. The project was awarded to a contractor called Sabota Excavating. They're a local company out of Jackson. They had done private tiling in this watershed and crossed these lines in the past. It was about a $3.5 million improvement. So we have a pre-construction meeting, and we invite all of the landowners. We invited EDF, and then 2 other companies showed up, Taka New World and Marabuni Power International, guys in suits from Ann Arbor and New York, and they had a lot of concerns about the project. So we met with them separately after the pre-construction meeting. They decided that they thought a permit was needed to be in there right away. I pushed back and said the drainage system was there first. There was an agreement with the county, as Tim explained, and said, we're crossing your lines. We developed an agreement letter. We did update some standards that they wanted to see. They also said they would be shutting down all of the crossings when we cross them. And they wanted the watershed district to pay for the time that the lines were shut down. I told them that was not going to happen, and they could leave their lines operating, they still decided that they were going to shut them down. They wanted multiple day notices. Everybody had to take a safety training that would be on site. And then they said they had the power to shut down any construction within the wind farm at any time. Also, they requested, there was a part of the system that crossed 4 lines that went into a substation, that we bore underneath those to avoid shutting those down. We did work with them and they were willing to pay for some extra cost to do that. So after bid, we developed a new detail to essentially harness and hold each one of the crossings, where we would put in a pipe and then tie each crossing to that when we crossed it. Here's kind of what that looks like. So the contractor had a pipe and they connected the electrical line to that, so there wouldn't be any sag in the electrical line. You can see just everything that was in place. This is a trench box. Here is the 40, I believe this at this location was a 42-inch tile. Here's another crossing after we started backfilling it. They requested that we keep that line harnessed until we had it completely backfilled, or close to completely backfilled. So during construction, we had to work with the 2 companies. I had multiple calls. They brought a representative from Georgia to watch each one of these crossings to make sure that nothing happened to it. And then almost one of the first days of construction, the contractor was out locating tile ahead of some of the mainline construction. And one of the landowners had plowed through the Gopher 1 stakes where one of the power lines was located. Luckily, our inspector was on site and he caught the contractor as he was starting to dig a hole and stopped him, which could have been a disaster. The windmill companies did find out about that because they were on site and shut down the site, reminded everybody of our safety precautions. We went through those with the contractor, had another meeting. We had a potential delay because the contractor wanted to cross a line around the 4th of July and they couldn't, the windmill companies couldn't get their representative there in time. So we worked through that. And then we bored a tile right through the middle of a field, which rarely ever happens. Here's that example of boring a tile through a field. This is part of the substation. The green line is our proposed tile. It's a 42-inch tile in this location. The black lines are the existing tile. There were 2 mains in this location. And here are all the power lines coming out of the substation. So we bored a 42-inch tile underneath those to keep the substation working. And again, did work with those companies, and they did pay some of those additional boring costs. Initially, they did not want to, and we told them we would open cut it, and they decided to pay those costs so they could keep their substation running. Here's just a picture of boring operations during construction. Some more pictures of those electrical crossings. We had 19 of them. So lessons learned: coordinate, and then be ready for surprises. Have crossing procedures discussed ahead of time, which we did, and then they ended up changing. And don't let the utility push you around. We utilized the fact that the drainage easements were there first. There was an agreement for those crossings, and we got them to pay for additional costs by standing our ground. Having good requirements is important. And again, safety is really important. Our inspector was out on site. The county had documented where all these lines were located. Flags got taken out, inadvertently, but having all of that information, we were able to save a dangerous situation from the contractor hitting a live power line. So just an example of what can happen afterwards. So thank you for letting me present, and open it up for questions on any of our presentations.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Chris. Any questions from folks on the presentations or just kind of related questions associated with utility crossing situations similar to this or different situations that you may have in your own districts? I can't believe that there would be no questions. I've been around this crew before. There's a lot of folks in here with good information. Chuck and Chris, I'll ask in that order. Chuck first, and then Chris. I'm curious your thoughts. So we've talked a lot this morning about utility crossings, and it's been pretty specific to larger sort of utilities of windmills and pipeline type crossings. Are there components of the work that you guys have experience in dealing with on these types of crossings that can relate to other sorts of utilities? Like I know Myron threw in the chat box earlier the question on working with CenturyLink or working with other utility companies, and Ashley talked a little bit about water line crossings and other sorts of utilities that exist out there. So are there lessons learned here that you think can relate to instances where it's not quite as dramatic as a nest of oil pipeline crossings or a massive wind farm?
Well, I'll just repeat a little bit of what I covered is try to coordinate ahead of time. Pick on some projects we've been doing in Jackson County. There's a lot of rural water lines, and those rural water lines were put in underneath the existing tile, but come in conflict many times with if you're going to do an improvement by deepening it a foot or two. And working ahead with those companies, they've come out and actually lowered the lines ahead of us. So as much coordination as you can do at the front end, I think can save dollars on the back end. You're always going to have some surprises, but that's something that I think we all know that, but it's just good to reiterate that.
Thanks, Chuck. Chris, any thoughts on your end on things that you think are worth application outside of the realm of these larger scale types of intersections?
Well, yeah, similar to what Chuck was saying, I think, with the communication, I think education of these different utilities is very important. We try to mention that to them anytime that we have any discussions, be it with a project or any other engagement we may have with a utility company, letting them know that hey, if you are doing work out here in the watershed district, you need to get a permit. And particularly if you're doing any work anywhere near any of these public drainage systems, which they may or may not have an understanding exist. Some of these public drainage systems look like creeks. Some of them are, tiles that are underground. They may not be aware of the implications of what they're doing on the landscape. And so just as Ashley had talked about earlier, getting the word out that you need to have discussions with us before you do work. And maybe, there again, Barb Cedarberg with Gopher State One Call can maybe provide some insight into how we might be able to engage them in different ways.
Perfect. Chris, we did have one come in the chat box for you, and maybe a little bit related to some of the conversation I had on the previous presentation from the Rice Creek Watershed District, where the pipeline crossings that were exposed due to erosion or degradation of the channel over time, especially given the rapidly developing watershed and the changing hydrology from increased impervious. Do any of these reflect the need for stabilization and restoration instead of pipeline replacements?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we do need to take a look at what the original channel bottom of the drainage system is. And that's, Ashley alluded to that earlier, they getting a good bead on that as constructed and subsequently improved condition of the system. I think there's a great disparity across the state and how well that is known, given that there are some areas of the state, particularly in the southern parts of the state, where ditches have been cleaned out regularly. But as you work further north, you oftentimes find ditch systems that haven't been touched in a long time that have built up sediment. And so where that original channel bottom is may not be well known unless you do an investigation. So that's kind of the first step we do. And there are certainly some areas where there may have been some scouring, particularly if you have areas that have a greater amount of energy to them. You know, it's ditch systems that are steeper. In cases like Rice Creek Watershed District, with how flat the systems are there isn't a lot of scouring of those channels due to the fact that there is so little energy in the system. But there are other areas where that may be a bigger concern.
Yeah, I think a note that I'll throw on that as well, if I can, is just that, you know, in some instances, the scour that seems to take place when these pipelines have been around is a result in as I think you noted, Chris, and Ashley talked about, you know, some of these areas, the ditches just haven't been maintained in a while. And it's possible that when those pipelines went in, the ditches were not at the grade that they were supposed to be. Maybe, you know, 6 inches or a foot, or in some instances, maybe even more sediment, depending on the grades. And when the pipelines were put in, they were okay with a foot of cover at the time. And you go in to do a repair, and all of a sudden that foot's not there anymore. So it seems like it's exposed as a result of, you know, scouring those things. But at the end of the day, if it's just a public water system, then it becomes more of a DNR regulatory issue with those pipelines and their exposure in the stream channels. In a lot of the instances we've talked about, they do serve either a multiple purpose or solely as a public drainage system. So we have a designed and you know, as constructed, subsequently improved elevation that we need to work off of to maintain that drainage. So it can vary. Another chat. Oh, go ahead, Chris. I look like you were going to say something.
This is Chuck.
Yep.
I was just going to add, you know, I liked to see when Ashley said they had 5 feet of separation. With tile systems, we see a lot of improvements that need to gain 2 or 3 feet of depth. So when you, as a group, as we start looking at permits, take that into consideration also, that you may want to have installations planned for potential improvements. I've worked with even the DOT on this, where we put culverts in lower than they should, but knowing that the rest of the system needs more depth, and that's going to happen in the future.
Chris, were you going to say something as well?
Oh, I was just going to mention that you talked about public waters, and as I had mentioned before, the DNR Land and Minerals Division licenses those crossings, and part of that license that they have is a notation that all other regulatory agencies that are involved in the pipeline company is responsible for coordinating with them. But one of the things is that they don't necessarily specify who those other regulating agencies may be, you know, and I think that might be something that could be also looked at, as to have more clarity and a document like that to indicate who some of those agencies may be. You know, it doesn't necessarily always have to be an inclusive list, but at least give some indication of, hey, you've got to talk to the county or the watershed district.
So also a couple other items in the chat for folks who may not be able to see it. Myron chimed in saying that, indicating again from Red Lake Watershed District, they've got a great working relationship with all the local utilities. You know, Minnesota statute requires notice be sent to all utilities for hearings, but in his experience, utilities outside of the state just don't necessarily show up, or the relationship is different, in part because they're probably just not as familiar with the statutory requirements and how the drainage systems function here. Marcy Wynant, and I apologize if I mispronounced the last name, appears to be Rice Creek Watershed District, also mentioned the issue of pipelines and pipeline safety as a policy statement developed by the Clean Water Council. Gopher One's very involved with the Clean Water Council on that, so I'm sure that this sort of discussion of pipeline crossings on some of these water features has become a more and more of a recognized issue. Not to say that it wasn't an issue before, but maybe more broadly recognized, as a lot of those clean water projects are happening. And Myron also put in, again, getting a local contact for all utilities is also very important, but it's not that always easy to get for companies outside of the state. Again, local contact for CenturyLink was from Fargo, 130 miles away, and was virtually impossible to get to return phone calls. And actually had to head over had to go over his head to get a person from Denver. So again, I think Myron lays out an important note there. Getting a hold of the right person or finding a right contact for some of these things is important. And keep in mind too, while much of the discussion is revolved around, oil pipelines and gas pipelines, it's important to recognize that there's a lot of other utilities out there that can cause issues. If there's rural water lines, I know there's rural water that's provided in southwestern part of the state in a lot of areas. So there are water lines for potable water. There are fiber optic lines. There are smaller gas lines. We've even heard of instances where, for example, a gas pipeline might be running through a field that's a main high pressure line. And in some instances, there are locations where there are taps that come off of them that were agreed to with landowners but as a part of selling the easements to put those lines in, that provides resources for their farm operations that maybe not a part of the bigger system. So utility crossings can be complicated. Linear projects, as you're all well aware, drainage projects can be complicated. You lose the ability to move things laterally left and right in the landscape. And as Chuck alluded to, it's even more complicated when you're talking about linear projects vertically. If you're doing improvements or repairs, the objective is to meet a certain elevation. And so it can be challenging when you really need to actually thread the needle. And then you get multiple utilities that cross that by their very nature tend to be fairly linear in nature. It can be pretty complicated. And so we've talked a fair amount about some of the examples that some drainage authorities use for their management of those processes, how they look at permits or development agreements. We've talked a fair amount to this point about some examples of real world situations where these things have crossed. And hopefully we'll be able to bring some of that back through also then with our next presenters, talking about some legal benefits to how you acquire right of way, how you acquire easements for your drainage systems that may help navigate some of that in the future. Any other questions for Chris or Chuck or myself around these topics? Again, feel free to, if you have a question, go to that reactions button and raise your hand. We can call on you or throw it into the chat box and we can hopefully address it. We've got just a couple minutes here before we'll hand it over to the folks from Rinky Noonan to talk about some of the legal aspects of easements and right of way.
I can just add in quick, having that type of development agreement like Tim had presented is very beneficial. Sorry, there's construction going on here. But we had a drainage authority that did not have that in place. And a solar company came in and designed a solar field right over the top of county tile. And they had to redesign their whole system once it got to the county level. So coordination up front can save everybody dollars.
Chuck, so when that sort of thing happened, and experiences in dealing with the permits, maybe Chris or Chuck, how much headway do you need or how much lead time as a drainage authority to make sure you've got the right mechanisms in place is really helpful, so that when a utility comes in, they've got, whoa, here's a project, and all of a sudden you need to react. Is it even reasonable to think that you can put together that sort of information in the timeline you'd need if you're not thinking about it in advance?
Yeah, I mean, it could take months. The solar project that I talked about was fortunately going through a repair and an improvement. So we had survey, we had plans, and we were able to work with them fairly quickly with an alignment change. But when you talk about any watershed district or county process, you've got maybe one meeting a month or two meetings a month. So you've got to, there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen. So you do need some time to put those things together. Months, not weeks, typically.
Yeah, and part of that depends on who is driving the bus. If it's a project that's led by the county or watershed district in the case of improvement, then then there's a little more onus on us to get that early coordination in. If it's something that the utility company is proposing to work on, well, we certainly, everybody is benefiting from early coordination, but the onus becomes on them to do the coordination.
Right. Thanks, gentlemen. So again, we're about ready to transition over to our next speakers here. So thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Chris, for sharing some of these examples. And certainly, I suspect if you don't mind, if you could both just type in your contact information in the chat box at some point. So if folks have questions, they know how to get a hold of you. I will do the same. And with that said, I will ask either Cale or John